This Friday, June 12th, a space company will make history by making itself available to the public via an IPO, an initial public offering, giving you a chance to own a piece of the future of space exploration. At a value of $1.75 trillion, SpaceX shares will go on sale in what's on pace to be the biggest IPO in history by a mile. Before we dig into why this matters for you, let me first put that valuation number in perspective. If you stacked $1.75 trillion in $1 bills, you would have a pile of cash reaching halfway to the moon. Lay those same bills end to end, and they'd stretch nearly twice the distance from here to the sun. And if that doesn't paint a clear enough picture, know that this event could also make one man, Elon Musk, the first trillionaire in the history of the universe. The sum is, in a word, astronomical. But will we look back on this historic milestone and say, that was the day the space economy earned its place as the biggest commercial opportunity in history? Or will we say it was the peak of a hype bubble, practically bursting at the seams? To begin to answer that, let's first set one thing straight. When I say the space economy, what do you picture? A couple of astronauts doing experiments in the International Space Station. Maybe the James Webb Telescope snapping photos of distant galaxies. And if that's all that the space economy is, how on earth is it worth trillions? We haven't put a human back on the moon in more than 50 years. For decades, space exploration felt like a museum exhibit collecting dust. Something for astronauts and engineers, but not for the rest of us. A priority of the 60s that we left behind and almost forgot, like bell-bottom jeans. So is the space economy even real? Or is SpaceX peddling science fiction? Well, while most people weren't looking, space quietly stopped being about flags and photos and quickly turned into a heated race to build up infrastructure. To understand how, we follow the money to see who's writing the checks. The US government now looks to space to achieve three things at once: exploration, security, and commerce. There's a missile defense program nicknamed Golden Dome, basically a modern reboot of the 1980s Star Wars idea, except this time cheap rockets and mass-produced satellites make it genuinely plausible. Prototype contracts worth up to $3.2 billion have already gone to a dozen companies, SpaceX among them, against a program estimated near $185 billion. Washington is putting real money and political weight behind this. But it's not just Washington that's investing big. And that's why the second space race is on. China is targeting its out-crewed lunar landing, and this time the race is not for a flag-planting photo op. The race is on to set up a permanent base on the moon. This raises an important question. Why does anyone care about going back to the moon again for any amount of time? It's because of what's up there. You see, the moon is more than just space dust. The headline prize is water ice, frozen in the permanently shadowed craters at the lunar poles. Out in space, water ice isn't just water. It's 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen. Split them apart and you have the basis for breathable air and rocket fuel. Water ice on the moon can be thought of like oil here on Earth. It's energy buried into the ground, and whoever controls it and extracts it reaps its rewards. Unlike a barrel of oil on Earth, though, fuel that's already up on the moon is doubly valuable, because you don't have to haul it up from Earth. A very expensive trip. A gas station of sorts on the moon is the ticket to unlocking the solar system. So whoever controls that location may control the most valuable out-of-this-world real estate available. But there's more to the modern-day space economy. Starlink, SpaceX's satellite internet arm, is already creating value out in space today. It keeps war zones and disaster areas connected when other networks can't. That value is one more reason that governments, civilians, and militaries are suddenly waking up to the value that's in space. Where there's energy, resources, or scarcity, you can find value. And space has all three, plus enormous strategic value to the 2 biggest economies on Earth, which we'll get into. Some of the promises of space exploration remain science fiction for now. asteroid mining, moon factories, unlimited energy. But those are increasingly looking like real possibilities too when you look just a bit farther out. We'll focus first on what's already here today and what's coming this week. The SpaceX IPO and its gargantuan valuation. What SpaceX actually does right now, what it might do in the future, and why it's valued at nearly $2 trillion. If asked what SpaceX does, most people would probably respond with one word: rockets. And most people would be mostly wrong. Today, SpaceX is really three businesses packaged as one: space, connectivity, and AI. And here's the twist. In 2025, SpaceX is arguably less of a rocket company than it is a satellite internet company. That satellite internet business is Starlink, and it's the quiet monster of the SpaceX story. Its revenue nearly tripled from about $4 billion to $11.4 billion in just 3 years. And it's profitable, generating roughly $7.2 billion in adjusted earnings last year. Starlink has 10.3 million customers, up from just 2.3 million 2 years ago. More than 9,600 satellites in orbit. About 3/4 of every working maneuverable satellite up there belongs to SpaceX, and they're launching about 100 more every single week. Then SpaceX has its rockets. They're not the biggest profit center, but they are the competitive moat. Since 2023, SpaceX has launched more than 80% of all the mass humanity has put into orbit. 80%. Around 650 launches total. And last year, 95% of their missions flew on reusable boosters, the differentiator that allows SpaceX launches to scale like no other companies. On top of that, the SpaceX Dragon capsule has flown 78 astronauts, making it the backbone of American human spaceflight this decade. But the story doesn't end there. SpaceX owns the entire chain of operations. They build the rocket, build the satellite, launch it on their own rocket, run the network, which communicates with its own lasers, and then they sell you the service. No other company on Earth does all of that. It's in a position to take advantage of unique possibilities. This is why, to understand its valuation, you have to use a little imagination and think as much about what it might do as what it does today. Investors have seen before that you can't always value a company by where it begins. Uber started as a black car app, and if that was all they had been, you probably wouldn't know them today. But they went on to eat the taxi market, then went after food delivery. Similarly, Amazon initially sold books, but soon after that they sold everything. Then they became the logistics and cloud backbone of the internet. In fact, their satellites compete directly with SpaceX's Starlink. If you'd valued either one on what it did on day one, you'd have missed the bigger picture. SpaceX is valued at nearly $2 trillion because investors are betting it's that kind of company. A machine that keeps using one advantage to expand into new businesses. This brings us to the third and weirdest pillar of the business: AI. SpaceX is increasingly tangled up with Musk's AI ambitions, and it has real contracts here. A reported Google Cloud deal worth around $920 million a month, tied to roughly 110,000 NVIDIA chips, plus an Anthropic arrangement involving hundreds of thousands more. But the AI business actually lost about $1.2 billion last year. There are ambitions of putting AI data centers in orbit, but that has never been attempted at scale. Bringing it together, SpaceX has layers. Rockets are the credibility engine, proof they can do impossible things. Starlink is the cash flow story, the part that pays the bills today. And then there's optionality. Mars, point-to-point travel across the planet, lunar infrastructure, floating data centers. The stuff that's hard to price because it hasn't happened yet. That's the X factor in SpaceX. Two things make these possibilities more than just fantasy. The first is Starship. If it works as designed, fully reusable, sending 100-ton payloads to orbit in its current version, and targeting 200 tons in the next, then giant satellite constellations, cargo to the moon, even data centers in space stop looking like fantasy and more like logistical challenges. Every infrastructure revolution, railroads, electricity, the internet, looked wildly overpriced right up until the businesses nobody predicted showed up. It's all connected through the second key factor, Elon, whose companies seem to hold the critical ingredients for success across the entire stack: launch, satellites, ground stations, solar, and the dish on your roof. You can squint and see where this goes. His Optimus robots as the construction crew for Mars, millions of Tesla cars feeding real-world data to train AI, and maybe even acting as distributed computers. That part is speculative and, to be clear, has not been publicly announced. But it's exactly the kind of consolidation that makes investors dare to dream. The bull case is that you're buying a company that turns cheap access to space into a repeatable model for conquering one new market after another. The uncomfortable counterpoint: SpaceX is unprofitable overall, and that's projected to get worse before it gets better. So we have an understanding of SpaceX and some sense of where that huge valuation might be coming from. But why go public now? SpaceX built its commanding lead without ever taking a dollar from public investors. In the past, it's actually opted to do the opposite of what it's doing this week. It bought back shares and typically only sold shares to provide liquidity to employees and investors. So something has changed. We'll explore why SpaceX would IPO and why now specifically. We'll cover this and much more in part 2 of this video, launching later today. Please subscribe to be notified as soon as it's ready. We'll see you very soon. Until then, stay curious.